was very important, that the whole Ma'anya in essence is a question. How could we be celebrating Galut, Geula, redemption, if we're in Galut? That's on page 8. And we say that this is the bread of affliction. If you look through the order of the Seder of the Seder, so to speak, the order of the Seder, you see a constant contradiction, a constant dialectic, a constant paradox. And that was what we described in the questions of the Manish Tana. Right? Namely, the Manish Tana, that's what we did last week. Manish Tana was one question. What's the one question of the Manish Tana? And it really pays, to tell this to your guests. It really pays to stop and tell this to your guests that the Manish Tana, why these 4 questions? You could ask a question on the questions, right? The Jews always answer one question with another question. And there was a little old man who was sitting in trial, and every time the lawyer asked him a question, he would ask another, he would answer with a question. So the judge said, how come you keep doing that? He says, why not? So, but it's okay to ask a question right here on the Manish Tana. Why these questions? What's specific about these 4 questions? What did we answer last week? The answer last week, the questions per se are not relevant to the individual activities of the Seder. Because we have many, we do strange things through the year. If you look at it as, an alien looking in, you're looking into the circumstances of the holidays. Here you pick up a $60 lemon, and here you pull a chicken, and here you do this. Strange stuff. But we don't ask, why do you do this, why do you do that as part of the ritual? Why do we ask the questions over here? And why specifically about these things? Many things that we do during the Seder that could elicit question. It could be she'elah. So the Abar Ben El answered that it's really one question. What's the one question? Where do we ever have, the first 2 questions are questions of matzah and morar. The second 2 questions are questions of dipping your food and reclining, right? So the first 2 questions by themselves don't throw us. Matzah and morar, that's appropriate because it's a night that recognizes suffering. And it's appropriate to have commemorations of suffering per se. That's understandable. The last 2 issues, the dipping and the reclining, that's also understandable. To commemorate celebration and joy, that also fits in very nicely. The question of the Manish Tana, why is this night different from all other nights, that where else do we have a time in the Jewish year where we're doing both in the same night? At the very same moment that we're celebrating sadness or commemorating sadness and sorrow, we're also celebrating and also luxuriating. That's the question. The question is one of contradiction. What do we ever have a night that stands for such a statement of contradiction? And that's the question of Manish Tana. Now, if you look at all of the individual parts of it, take matzah, for example. In matzah, we break the middle matzah in the beginning. Remember the yachatz? You break the middle matzah into 2 sections. And we mentioned last week, just a few words of review, we mentioned last week that when you break the middle matzah, you have a smaller part and you have a, very good. The larger part you put in the bag for the afikomen, and the smaller part you let remain. And the larger part represents geula, redemption. That's for the end of the Seder. That's for acharit hayamim, so to speak, the end of days, the end of the Seder. And that's for the afikomen, which represents korban, the sacrifice and redemption. So one half of the matzah, the larger part, is placed immediately in a wrapper, right, in some napkin, or some people have special afikomen pouches. They're available for only $9.99, right? I'm joking, I don't know what they cost. But some people have afikomen pouches. And that's hidden. Now, the word matzah is a homonym with the word matzah, which means, limso means to find. One is with a hey, matzah to find is with an aleph, right? And the word matzah means, limso means to find. So there's something hidden in the concept of matzah, because the matzah represents that which is hidden. On the one hand, we taste in matzah the lechem oni. We have the broken piece right in front of us. The smaller piece, the less consequential piece, is sitting right in front of us, and the broken, smaller piece represents sorrow, represents trouble, exile, eating the bread of affliction. But the larger piece we have to search for. This larger piece is redemption. The larger piece is atid, is the future. And therefore the word matzah itself means a search, limso, to search for something, to find. Namely, it's within our grasp. It's something that we could conquer if we wish to have it. And therefore the Seder also represents an order of a search into ourselves, a search for Hashem, and a search for the redemption historically of Klal Yisrael. So matzah represents a double-edged sword. The charoset, the maror, also represents a double-edged sword. How so? The best type of maror available, according to the poskim, is the chazeret, is romaine lettuce. That's the most preferable bitter herb, for several reasons. The difficulty with it is the fact that it has bugs. So if you get the bugs out, literally you get the bugs out of the maror system, right, then it's okay. Then you can use it. The bitter herbs, the maror itself, as chazeret, as the romaine lettuce, is preferable because it starts out with a sweet taste. It only has a bitter aftertaste. And that in itself is an interesting statement. First of all, it's a statement that Chas Rachmana al B'nai Yisrael, that God has mercy on the Jewish people. It doesn't, even when it comes to commemorating bitterness, it doesn't want it to do with something too bitter. You know? Sounds like a Jewish mother, you know? But that's the type of mercy that Hashem has for us. There's also a theme within that in my mind is also quite important. And that is the nature of galut, of exile and suffering. The Egyptian exile started with sweetness. Why? Because the Jewish people were so, as the Haggadah emphasizes, and we'll see it, the Jewish people started in Goshen, in the land of Goshen. When they were living in Egypt, they were separated from everybody else. That was Yaakov's desire, to keep the Jews separated in Goshen. Moved out, removed. Yaakov died, and Yosef died in his generation, and then the Torah says, Vatimolei ha'aretz otam. The land filled up with them, all over the place. All over the place. Vatimolei ha'aretz otam. Why? Because the Jews were overwhelmed. The Egyptians were so nice to them. They had privileges. They had opportunities to being accepted like everyone else. So it started out with a great deal of sweetness, you know, because the bitter herbs that we start out attracts us, pulls us in with that sweetness, that sense of well-being. So sometimes the bitterest of herbs, historically, for the Jewish people, start out sweet. There's another interesting contradiction or paradox within the maror, and that's that we take the maror, and what do we dip it in? The charoset, right? We dip it in the mixture of the charoset, which is a combination of wine and apples and dates, and they have a little brick that they send from Tel Shiva for charoset, but usually the wives make their own.
Is that wine?
Yeah, I don't know what it is. It's something like that. You just add the wine and bubbles up into charoset. Every year we keep the package from Tel Shiva. You could make 5 or 6 walls on a house with that stuff. You know, just keeps building up. Add the wine and it cements together all by itself. Just pour it into the top. Right. So with the charoset, the statement of charoset is also interesting. Charoset is sweet. Right? It's wine, apples. It's a sweet mixture on the one hand. On the other hand, what does it represent? The mortar that the Jewish people worked in slaves. So if you think about it, here's an opposite theme. Here's an opposite theme. Here with the charoset, it's sweet, it represents mortar, but it really is sweet. And this is really an interesting statement of perception in life. Because the bitter herbs look sweet and turn out to be bitter. The charoset, the bitter, after being tasted, can actually be sweet. In other words, an important theme to perhaps mention at the Seder, because in terms of our own personal searches, is that while we... That's right, next week is the Seder. While we have the opportunity... You ever hear somebody talk about the good old days? You know, let's say like older people in their advanced 30s, you know, really old people. You know. You ever hear somebody talk about the good old days? It's always interesting. They usually talk about, they had all of these troubles yet, but we used to have freezing cold, even in the summer, and we would go without eating, we would go without drinking for 3 weeks, right? And then when we got a cup of water, I had to give it to my baby brother, right, because he was more thirsty than I. And we would walk 25 miles every single time that we had to go to the bathroom, and you hear all these stories, and sometimes they sound a little bit exaggerated, a little bit put on, but you hear all these very strange things. But people talk about adversity of the past sometimes in very glowing terms, because we can't really judge a situation. We can't certainly control the situation. All we can judge, whether it's good or bad, is how we react to it, how we respond to it. And so when we deal in the Seder with the historical problems, holach ma'anya, the bitterness that we've affected, sometimes we realize that we ourselves put ourselves in that predicament. It starts out sweet and we get all chopped up in it and end up with a very bitter taste. And it's interesting because the way that you dip, we mentioned this last night, the way that you dip the maror, the bitter herbs, into the charoset is you dip it in and then you shake it off. Right? At that time people are usually hungry. So they take the stalks and they scoop out, a nice thing like a turkey leg. It looks like anything. Now that's not appropriate. You're supposed to dip in the maror, a piece of the maror or an edge of the maror. You're supposed to dip that into the charoset and then to shake it off. So what are you left with? You're left with a taste of sweetness. You're left with a reminder of what was. And that's also a statement. Now, when we mentioned about Adam Rishon, about the first man, right, that at paradise, being in Gan Eden, for one day, less than one day, we were in paradise, right? One day, then we couldn't afford the rent. We had to go out of paradise. We ate from the Eitz Hadat, we ate from the Tree of Knowledge. That very day, we were kicked out of the Eitz Hadat, out of the Gan Eden. The question is, why were we there for such a short time? Why did God put us there all together? I mean, it's ludicrous. It could have been on a condominium in Florida someplace, for a day. I mean, what difference does it make? Well, some people hold that's paradise also. It's really not. No, it's been 105 degrees there. That's certainly not paradise. Levine's house. Oh, that's paradise. That's paradise.
Bedtime. The bedtime.
That's paradise. And everyone's welcome over there later tonight, so you can help clean up. So in that, question is, why? And the answer that we've discussed many times is that because you've tasted it once, because the flavor was there, it gives us an idea of what could be. With all this bitterness, you can still taste that pang, that taste, that hint of what could be, the sweetness. So we begin, there are really two ways that we begin our Haggadah. Last week we spoke about the paragraphs on Ma'aseh Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshuv, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, on page 10. Right? These were the rabbis who were sitting, and historically, those rabbis who were sitting at the time in Bnei Brak were sitting under the rule of the Romans, and what they were plotting was the ability to have redemption. And that's really the relevance of talking about the Shema in the morning. There are two times that a Jew is obligated to say Kriyat Shema. B'shachbacha uv'kamecha, when you go to sleep, when you wake up. Our view of the day, a Jewish day, begins when? Always in the nighttime. With one exception. There's one location in the world where the day begins in the daytime, not at night.
One location?
In the whole world. And that's applying to the temple, to the Beit HaMikdash. In the temple, the night followed the day. Right? So, Temple Israel was not the first place to make innovations. Right? In the Beit HaMikdash, Lahavdil, in the Beit HaMikdash, the night followed the day. What type of message can you get out of there? The Haggadah asks the question, Yachol Mirosh Chodesh. I don't know why they made it so small.
But you can skip it.
Yeah, maybe it tells you can skip it. Talmud Lomar Bayomahu. I would think that I could fulfill the mitzvah of saying Haggadah from the beginning of the month. Why from the beginning of the month? Because that was the time that they were given the first mitzvah of making the month, of consecrating the months. That was the first mitzvah for the Jewish people. So what? So what? Well, freedom for a Jew is defined by mitzvot. So I would think, Yochomi Rosh Chodesh, I would think that since we became free by the observance of mitzvot, and at the Seder, I'm not want to stop at this time to talk about what freedom means for a Jew. And I always tell over that story about Yaakov Mendelevich. Remember that story? Did I tell you that story? A powerful story. Remember that story? Powerful story. But Yosef, did I say Yaakov? Yosef Mendelevich. Yosef Mendelevich was a Russian prisoner of Zion. He was arrested after a failed attempt to take a plane and fly it out of the Soviet Union. You remember. One of their group, as he told us, one of the group was KGB. And when they got to the airport and they had a pilot amongst them, they were going to take the plane, they would have going to send it back and they would have paid for it once they got there, but they just wanted out. One of them was KGB, and they got to the airplane. All of a sudden, they were surrounded by troops. He said, even on the trip, he says he knew something was wrong. Everything was too quiet. The roads were quiet. The airport was like nobody was there. He knows, but it was like too late to go back. And it wouldn't have really mattered. So he was in jail. And they put him in he was sentenced to many, many years, 13 years, I believe, of hard labor, in one of the intense labor camps. And the first Shabbat that they wanted him to work, so he told them, it's Shabbat, I don't work on Shabbat. So they said, Mendelevich, this is not a resort. You have to work. He says, no, I'm a Jew, I don't work on Shabbat, period. So fine, we're very flexible. We'll give you a chance to mull it over, to think it over. They put him in this isolation box. They put him in this 5x5 tin, metal tin, out in the cold yard. And there he had a slab of board, and he had a bucket for his facilities. And every day they brought him a piece of bread and a glass of water. And he divided up the bread into 3 sections. The sweetest part of the bread, the crust, he put under the board. The major part of the bread he ate, and a little crumb he put back on the tray, like to tell the guard, I'm full, I don't need anything. When he figured out that it was Shabbat, he took a stone and he drew Nerot Shabbat, he drew Shabbos candles, sketched them onto the wall, on the metal. And when Shabbat was just about coming, he sketched in the candle, the flame, and he made the Shabbat candle ignite. And then he took out all the bread that he had accumulated from the week, and he cut off from the bottom of his pants, he cut off the 2 pieces of cloth. One piece he put on his head, and the other piece he put over the chalot. Then he made kiddush, and then he ate his Suda of Shabbat, and then he got up and he danced, and he started dancing. Enjoy! And he was dancing and singing. And of course, metal reverberates, that sound. The guard came rushing to that little hole there and said, looked inside, so Mendelevich singing and dancing. He said, Mendelevich, you're going crazy, you're sugar. He says, no, I'm not crazy. He says, what are you doing? He says, what do you want I'm doing? I'm singing and dancing. He says, why? He says, this is my Sabbath, Shabbat. He says, Shabbat, Sabbath. The guard said to him, wait a second, you think you're at your dacha? You think you're at your summer place? This is a Soviet prison, and you're a prisoner of the Soviet Union. He says, there you're making a mistake, my friend, Mendelevich told him. It's Shabbat. And a Jew cannot be a prisoner on Shabbat. Tomorrow I'll be your prisoner, but today is Shabbat. This is a sense of heroism that we've lived through and lived with. Yachom Rosh Chodesh, I would think that since that's the beginning of the time they got the mitzvah, so that's freedom for a Jew, therefore the Haggadah would appropriate all the way back from then. Tamad Lomar B'Yamahu must be that specific day. I B'Yamahu Yachom Mibod Yom, I would think maybe it's the same day. Yachom Mibod Yom, I would say it's the daytime before. Tamad Lomar Ba'avur Zeh. You have to be specific. Ba'avur Zeh means because of this, namely, I infer that when the Torah says Bavor Zeh, you're supposed to be able to point this and point to the matzah and the maror and to say, this is Bavor Zeh, this is what I'm doing this for. That means at the time that you are able to fulfill the mitzvah of matzah and the mitzvah of maror, that's the time you can fulfill the mitzvah of Haggadah. They all come together, they're all wrapped up in one. That's the meaning of Ba'avor Zeh. And therefore, the expression is, I would think that it's in the first from Rosh Chodesh because that's her sense of freedom. Then we say, I would think that it's the daytime. Why? Because the daytime represents redemption. Right? Daytime always represents that which is good. The sun shining down on us, that which is good. It represents redemption. The answer is no, it has to be experiential. You have to experience the matzah and maror. Why? Because the celebration of Pesach is not only of what was, it's to try to gain the redemption of what will be. And therefore we have to look at the darkness of what we have, of galut, of exile and suffering now, in order to know how to get through it to the next day. So when we have the Shema, there are two paragraphs of the Shema. There are two times that we say the Shema in the daytime. Bishaf b'chov kumecha, when you go to sleep and you get up. Two separate concepts of recognizing and accepting the kingdom of God, not only when it's good, when things are okay, but when things are distressful and confronted and difficult as well. And the opposite is true also. Not only turning to God because you're in trouble, but you can see the glory of God in those things which are so-called good as well. So the question is, why do we start off the day with night and then go into day? Vayi erev, vayi voker, it's evening and morning for a Jew. Because in order to appreciate the morning, to appreciate the daytime, you have to know what night is like. I told you about Adam Arishon. The first man, when he woke up the first time, thought he was dead. Then he woke up and he's alive. You can't appreciate being alive unless you know what it's like to be dead. You can't appreciate freedom unless you know what it's like to be a slave. You can't appreciate luxury unless you know what it's like to have poverty. If you think about it for a second, if you think of any pleasure of the human being, if you imagine that that sensory port of your brain was constantly excited, right? That part of your brain which gives you pleasure, or any type of pleasure, if that was constantly stimulated, that section of your brain, after a while you wouldn't feel it. You wouldn't experience it. It wouldn't be anything. It would be normal. You know what I'm saying? If you... we hear a neurologist here about this. You're right. From electrical...
It'd be a nice way to go.
Well, I'm saying, let's say this goes on for 50 years and 60 years. Let's say there's a constant point of stimulus of pleasure in your brain.
If there's, like being married to a good woman for 50 or 60 years.
No, there's always challenge and confrontation, no matter what marriage is like, right? There's always that sense of confrontation. And I won't be any more specific, Dr. Goffert.
Most things will have to
But the point...
tolerance.
Yeah, after a while, it obviously, I mean, just from a rational point of view, sure, the electrical implication will remain the same. From a point of perception, you know, you only know that your hands don't hurt you anymore when your hands hurt you. You know, you don't know that, you're not thinking that your hands are comfortable now. They have to be in bitter cold, and when you come out from ice in bitter cold, and you warm up your hands, oh, it feels good, I'm machayim. That's life. And in order to be able to appreciate that which is bountiful, that which is pleasurable, unfortunately sometimes there has to be the maror and the matzah. But it's a matter of perception. You determine what anything is in your life. Nobody can do that but you. You determine how you're going to react to it. And therefore you determine what it's going to mean to you. There are two real beginnings of the story of the Haggadah. One of them is on page 9. Avadim hayinu l'Paro Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Paro in Egypt. That's one beginning of the answer. One beginning to the search of redemption is knowing where we were from. We were slaves.
We had a question. And we
let me just. Oh, what question that we started?
So we don't know why it was only said the two names of Nahum and Avram, and not the name of Aram. Aram, of a son of...
okay, well, but I thought you said we had a question that we had, that we dropped. No. We'll do that in a moment. There are two introductory answers to the question. The first is Avadim Hayinu. We were servants to Paro in Egypt. And the second is on page 13, Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zarah Hayu Avotenu. Originally our ancestors were idol worshippers. Those are the two beginnings to the answer of this question. Those are the two answers. How so? The Gemara raises the question, how do we begin the answer? So the Gemara concludes, Matchilin beginai u'misaymin b'shevach. You begin with that which is disparaging, that which is bad, troublesome, and then you go on to that which is praiseworthy, which is good and positive. And there's an argument in the Talmud, what is Ginai? What is the disparaging part that we're discussing now? What's the bad part that we're interested in right now? So there's one opinion is the physical slavery of Egypt. Avadim hayinu lefav Mitzrayim, we were servants to Paro in Egypt. And the other is the other side of the coin, the other side of the search. Mitchila ovdei avodah zarah hayu avotenu. Originally our ancestors were idol worshippers. And in between these two beginnings, we have the four sons that we began to speak about last week, right, with Fred McMurray. No, how he had three? My three sons. Okay, I'm sure, excuse me. Right, and it's a good point at the Seder to just point out, what could be the, what the names of all the three, of McMurray's three sons were, right? Did you bring back some good recipes? Oh. They had a Pesach cook workshop that wasn't kosher?
Right. Why does that surprise you?
Where's the next one?
I'll tell you why it surprises me. So there are two places where the Haggadah begins its answer. One place is on page 10, page 9, Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves, and the other is Mitchila Ovdei Avodah Zarah, our ancestors were idol worshippers. And it's interesting that the word Oved and the word Eved are the same, right? They're from the same root of doing service or servitude. And the nature of this, well, it makes sense, it's logical. The nature of the answers are also the same. That there's a physical type of freedom and there's a spiritual type of freedom. And the spiritual freedom, let's start from here. But God has brought us near. Now for a person to leave idolatry, a person to leave self-worship, which is really synonymous with idolatry, a person has to move themselves a bit. And it quotes from Yoshua, from the Bible, from the book of Joshua. Our ancestors lived for a long time on the other side of the Nahar, on the other side of the river. What does the word Hebrew come from? Heb. Right. Where does the word Hebrew come from? Ivri in Hebrew. And it comes from Aver HaNahar, the other side of the river. And the word la'avor, to pass over. The very word Hebrew means coming over from the other side, la'avor. And the concept was, if you think about it, Abraham was a searcher. When we spoke about the word matzah, meaning to find something, like how it's hominidical, whatever that means, it's a homonym with it's a homonym with the word matzah with an aleph. It means that in this search that the Haggadah is supposed to propel us on, this search of the Seder, this direction that we're supposed to be looking for, we have to recognize that there are two aspects of slavery, two particular aspects of slavery. One is physical. One is our enslavement to the society and daily life and troubles and conflicts and emotions and mindsets, etc., etc. That's one type of slavery. That's the Avadim Hayinu. We were servants. We had responsibilities to Paro in Egypt. Like we have responsibilities today to family, to bosses, to making a living and other things, which can enslave us. And then there's the spiritual enslavement, that when we just worship ourselves and nothing else counts, the focus of ourselves, Ibra Alis, over everything else. In the middle of these two discussions comes the four sons. There's one interpretation, an interesting interpretation, that says that the four sons, it's from the Passover Haggadah, in case you want to look it up, says that the four sons do not represent four different people, but the four sons represents four aspects of our own personalities. There are many different ways of looking at the four sons. One of the most common of the rabbis of the generation before us is to look at the four sons as the decimation of the Jewish population in Europe due to assimilation. First you start out with the Chacham, the wise son. That gave birth to the Reformation, where they said, let's just chuck it all. But the people knew. Right? There were people involved in the early Reformation in Germany, and they knew a lot, certainly compared to today's standards. But they gave birth to the person who was a tom, simple, gave a simple Hebrew school background to, and they never really had a chance to grow educationally. And they gave birth to the Eino Yodea Lishol, to the children who aren't even capable of asking the question. Right? That's a very common historical footnote that's attached to the four sons. It's very interesting that sometimes how it turns itself around, as we see in our generation, how the process turns itself around. All of a sudden the kids start asking questions and start finding and start looking for answers, and they turn around the parents. But that's a very cautious and slow process. Very cautious, right, as we all know. But the theme that the four sons represents one person is also an interesting theme. That there are different aspects to ourselves. Not that we're split personalities, hopefully not. Otherwise, you'd have to set more settings at the table. But the different aspects of ourselves, there are times, what does the Chacham want to know? He wants to know everything. And you tell him the details of law. But then there's the Rasha, who sees things as avodah. It's a pain. It's work. And we all know inside of ourselves, especially when it comes to Pesach, it's very easy to say, it's a pain, it's work. What does it mean, lochem, to you? I don't want to know what it means to me. I don't want to feel what it means to me. I just want to remove myself from it. And there's this defense mechanism that we all use that's part of the Rasha. Then there's a simple son. There's part of us that's whole and complete. Because here simpleton is a term that's used, not as a simpleton like we say in English, but tam means like Yaakov ish tam yoshev olim. It's a sense of perfection, a sense of calm, a sense of wholeness, where you know intrinsically, not because of your learning, not because of your great philosophical endeavors, you know inside of yourself that there's a God and the world is right and you've got your job to do. There's that part of us as well. And then there's the part Sheino Yodei Elisha, the opposite, that's apathetic. So there are two scenes, and each one has two ways to look at it. The Chacham wants to know in order to do. The Rasha wants to know in order not to do. The Tam is simple in his whole faith, while the Eino Yodei Elisha, the one who's not able even to ask the question, is simple in his lack of faith. I don't want to deal with it, and pushes it away. So these four parts of the personality, if you want to look at them, you understand what we're saying? That these might be four parts of even one person. Makes sense that in the middle of the two types of slavery that the Haggadah chronicles, physical slavery and spiritual slavery, lies us in between. And again, the Haggadah therefore represents this search into ourselves, about ourselves, finding those good capacities, finding those positive capacities, which are also about ourselves. Then the Torah goes through, then the Haggadah goes through a description of Jewish history and the struggles of our ancestors in reaching the point and the difficulties. If you look at page 14, remember what I told you elevate the cup of wine, put down the cup and say, remember when every time you pick up the cup of wine, you cover the matzot. There's this dynamic between the matzah of slavery and the cup of redemption, and how one intertwines, one intermingles with the other. Of course, each one of these lines is very wealthy in meaning. I have a Haggadah, which I tried not to look at too much before this class. I have a Haggadah. The whole purpose of the Haggadah is to go through the numerology of the Haggadah. Why there are certain number of phrases here and certain number of phrases here, and the numerical meaning of this, and the numerical value of this. Some of it's interesting. Some of it, to me, doesn't add up. But probably because of my own lack of mathematical prowess. But no, I have it. Doesn't matter for my computer either. But I wanted to talk to you about the Titzach Hadash B'Achav. There's a request that I do that. In the middle, we go to the Makot. Dam Svardei Akinim, Arav Dever Shchin. I always tell people that when I was a rabbi in Los Angeles at a Sephardi congregation, I used to get in trouble on Pesach. They used to talk about the first two plagues, the Dam Sfardim, and they used to get upset with me. So, okay, we just let Sanut. Okay. Then on the next side, Rabbi Huda Hayonosim Bem Simanim. Rabbi Huda gave a sign for it, Titzach Hadash B'Achav. So I'd like to turn over the shir to Dr. Gottlieb, who's going to give us a review of what I said 5 months ago when we did it. You ready?
Yeah.
Do you remember?
5%.
Oh. I was going to fall over my chair.
Giving it.
Well, first of all, I told the joke.
Okay.
Well, first of all, I told
the church guy that said
I know
you have a point, and you need that it's a code in Torah about valilot dam.
Right.
דם צריכים כולנו
על דת שעשינו.
על דת שעשינו
בין אלוהים חיים בירושלים. There was a the blood libel was a very strong libel against the Jewish people, and many people died because of it. Many people died because of it. And there's this, historically someone came up and said, and they're constantly looking for references in the Passover service that we're using Christian blood. And they said, that's why Rabbi Yehuda gave Simanim. He gave a secret code over here on page 20. Titzach Hadash B'Achav. That's the Dam Svardei Akinim, Arav Dever Shchin, Bar Arba Choshech B'Chorot. Those are the 10 plagues, the first initial 10 plagues. They said it's a symbol for what the Jews do on Passover. What it really stands for is Dam Tzrichim Kulanu. We all need blood. Al Dat She'asinu, the same way that we perform this on the Ben Elohim Chayim B'Yerushalayim, the Son of God of Jerusalem. They said that what we did to Jesus, that's what we're doing to all the Christian kids now. That's what they said. It was coding, right? What?
Who made the accusation?
This is some galach, some priest. I forgot the details.
Priest made the accusation.
Right. And this was very, very common during the Dark Age and medieval time. All the way up to the last case was the Bilis case in Russia. Right, in the Tsar. The last was the Bilis case where remember the book The Fixer by Bernard Melamed? That's about that case, the Bilis case, which is a true case. What was that, in the early 1900s? 1898, something like that, that it actually happened. And you look in books amongst our good friends and the Syrians and the Arab world in general, it still repeats the same thing, that we suck Christian blood and Muslim blood before Passover. It's not even kosher. Doesn't even make sense. So a rabbi got up, and I forgot who it was, but he immediately disputed that, and he said, no, you're right, it does refer to Alilat Dam. It does refer to the blood libel. What does it refer to? It says, Divrei Tzoreinu Kizavim, the words of our oppressors are false. Alilat Dam Sheker, the blood libel is a lie, regarding Ben Isha Chashuda Biznut, the son of that woman who we suspect of immorality. Right, remember the story. You explain to me later. The Beni Shachashudu B'Znut. Right? We didn't call him the... Yeah, right. The son of that woman that we suspected him.
There's also another
But-
thing
Yeah,
to explain why.
yeah, but I'm going to explain now more. That was more of an interesting highlight. Unless you know the words, you can't even tell it over. You know what to say. But there is a pattern. I don't have
Maybe you
time.
could just drop in and...
Sure,
And give
sure.
me the
Rabbi,
dessert
drop in. I'll bring Bonnie's rotisserie. All
He'll
that.
bring dessert.
Okay. Tetzach Hadash Bi'achav, if you look at it, each one represents a different level of attack. The Dam Sfardei Akinim, if you look at the pictures, no, you can't see the pictures. They're right out, the pictures are out
They all
of order.
come from the ground.
Yeah.
Out of
Dam-
the course of
good.
the Nile.
Dam Sfardei Akinim all come from the ground, the Nile or the land around the Nile. The blood emanated in the Nile, of course. The frogs came from the Nile, and the lice from the ground that was around the Nile. Right? So it came from the lowest level. Arov, Dever, Shchin. Arov are the wild animals coming from and attacking the homes of the Egyptians, right? They were just plagued with beasts all over the place. Like, like downtown Detroit. But even worse, really, real animals, real animals.
That's plantation religion.
Dever was the pestilence, right? Dever was pestilence, meaning that their animals died, and Shchin were boils. They got big blotches, big blisters all over their skin. That applied to things which walk on the ground, right? That's the second level of things. Started down here, the second level is up here, and then the third level, Barad was what? Hail, coming from heaven, Arba, the locust descending from the sky, and Choshech, the darkness that came down from on high. You understand the three groupings? But there's also, if you look at the first two of every group, you look in the Chumash in Shemot, in Va'era, and in Bo, you find the following. In those two parshiot, you find the following. You find Moshe and Aaron coming to Paro by the first plague and the second plague, and warning him, let my people go. Not on the third plague. They just got hit with the lice. You find Moshe and Aaron warning them by Arov and Dever, by the wild beasts and the pestilence. They just got boils, blisters, right? That third of the group. And in Barad and Arba, in the hail and the locust, Moshe and Aaron warned them, let my people go. And the darkness descended by its own accord. So in each one of the groups, the Makkah Pechot, the 10th, we'll put off on the side. In each one of the groups, the first two, there were warnings, and the third one was the actual punishment. And if you look at the nature of the levels that they were being affected, the third one was the most severe that affected them bodily, right? The Dam and the Tzfardei affected other things. The blood was removed from them, right? They had to go out and get it. The Tzfardei, the frogs, hopped onto them, right? And the Kinim, the lice, attacked them directly, okay, on their body. The Arov, the wild animals came from outside. The Dever affected their livestock inside. And again, the Shchin, their bodies. The Barad, the hail, came from the outside. The Arba, the locusts, actually came into their houses and was munching everything, even the Riceroni. And the Choshech descended inside of their very being, so that they couldn't even walk. They couldn't. People who were standing couldn't sit. People who were sitting couldn't stand. It was a pervasive darkness of the soul. And if you look at the last three letters, again, leaving out the bays at the end of number 10, but the last three in each of the column of three, Ches, Shin, Chaf spells what? If you look backwards, Choshech, darkness. And they're different. You see it? You know what I'm talking about? If you look at the last letter of the three groups, Ches, Shin, and Chaf, spells darkness. The last plague, the ninth plague, 9th out of 10, again, the 10th is totally separate. The last plague, the ninth plague, was a plague of darkness. But there was a darkness that was permeated, that affected them. Yeah, if you don't mind. If it doesn't stay. There was a darkness that affected them in their activities. And if you look at the level, just to think about it for a second, the first level of darkness, of punishment on them, was kinim, lice. Lice was on top of their skin. The next level was shrin, boils. Boils was literally under their skin. And the highest level of punishment was a choshech, was the darkness that emanated from their very souls. So there's a development or an evolution of punishment and of difficulty that the plagues represented. But it also represented, in a word, the process of sin. The process of sin starts from outside of yourself, attaches itself to you if you let it, then eventually becomes under your skin, and then creates the highest level of darkness, the darkness of the soul. You become anesthetized in a spiritual way.
Your wife would like you to call it before you go to your next place one day, before you go to your next place.
You do very well as a rabbi. Okay. So, what I would suggest, I guess this is the part where we're ready to say Dayenu. It's enough. It's late already. What I would suggest is to think about the themes that we've already discussed. I showed you just but a mere beginning of an insight into the Haggadah. I tried to give you a sense of concept and theme within the Haggadah, and I suggest that you do some homework before the Seder, so that you read through a few sources. I mentioned the Art School Haggadah has a few nice words here and there, and try to make it as relevant to us and as relevant to yourselves. The kids should be excited, it should be interesting. I know you have to deal with, all different levels of people. We deal with Chacham, we deal with Rasha, right? Like the four sons, we have to deal with all different levels of people. One should try to reach each person on their own level and use the Haggadah as a springboard for our own personal search and for that community that's represented in the Haggadah as well. Have any other questions? Any